The old military dog came through the emergency room doors before anyone knew his name. He was soaked from the rain, mud streaked along his legs, blood darkening the fur near his left shoulder, but he did not limp away or shake himself dry like an ordinary frightened animal. He moved beside the stretcher with the silent discipline of something trained to stay close no matter what happened. The paramedics were shouting over the storm outside. Nurses were clearing space. Monitors were being rolled into place. And in the middle of all that noise, the Belgian Malinois kept his amber eyes fixed on the unconscious man strapped to the gurney.
Easy now.
The man looked to be in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, even under the hospital blanket, with a grey beard, a deep scar along his jaw, and one hand curled so tightly around a torn piece of canvas that the paramedic had not been able to pry it loose. Nobody in the ER knew yet that his name was Chief Marcus Hale. Nobody knew he had once belonged to a Navy SEAL team whose missions never appeared in newspapers. And nobody knew that the dog walking beside him had already saved his life more than once. Nurse Emily Carter noticed the dog before she noticed the blood on the patient's shirt. That was not because she cared less about the man. It was because after 6 years on night shift, Emily had learned that the quietest thing in a room was often the thing telling the truth. The dog was not barking. He was not lunging. He was not acting wild. He was watching every hand that came near the veteran with the careful stillness of a soldier guarding a door. Emily stepped toward the stretcher and saw the patch on the torn canvas clutched in the man's hand. The letters were faded, but still readable beneath the grime. Rex. She looked down at the dog, his ears lifted slightly, as if he knew she had found his name. Male patient, unresponsive, possible head trauma, hypotensive in the field, one of the paramedics said, as they pushed the stretcher toward Trauma Bay 3. Found near the service road behind the old naval housing complex. No wallet, no phone. Dog wouldn't let us load him unless he came too. The younger paramedic glanced nervously at the Malinois. We tried calling animal control, but every time someone separated them, the patient's vitals spiked. The dog went crazy until we brought him back. Emily did not answer right away. She placed 2 fingers against Marcus Hale's wrist, checked the line already started in his arm, then looked at Rex again. The dog's breathing was shallow and controlled, but there was pain in the way he held his shoulder. Not panic, not aggression, pain. He's injured too, Emily said quietly. That's not our patient, said Dr. Patel from the head of the bed, already snapping on gloves. He was not cruel, only busy, and the ER was already short-staffed. Emily, help me stabilize the man first. I am, Emily said. She took the trauma shears from the tray and began cutting away the patient's soaked shirt. Beneath it were bruises, old surgical scars, and a fresh wound along his ribs that looked less like an accident than a warning. Rex moved closer as the fabric peeled back. A security guard near the doorway stiffened and reached for his radio, but Emily lifted one hand without looking at him. Do not crowd the dog. The guard frowned. Ma'am, hospital policy says animals can't be in a trauma bay. He is not wandering the cafeteria, Emily said, her voice still calm. He came in with an unconscious veteran, and he is the only reason your patient made it through the doors without crashing. That was the first moment the room changed. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone outside would have noticed, but the nurses heard it. The paramedics heard it, even Dr. Patel paused for half a second before ordering labs and imaging. Emily was not known for speeches. She was the nurse who took extra shifts without complaint, who remembered which homeless patient needed socks, who could calm an angry family member without raising her voice. She did not challenge people unless something mattered. And now, standing between a bleeding military dog and a security guard with one hand on his radio, Emily Carter made it clear that this mattered. Rex lowered himself beside the stretcher as Marcus was connected to monitors. The dog did not relax. His head stayed high. His body remained angled toward the door, blocking the easiest path to the unconscious man. Emily cleaned the blood from Marcus's temple, while another nurse called for a CT scan. When she moved near the patient's left side, Rex's eyes followed her hands. She slowed her movements and let him see everything before she touched Marcus again. I'm helping him, she murmured, not because she thought the dog understood every word, but because she had seen enough working dogs to know that tone mattered. Rex stared at her for a long second. Then, carefully, painfully, he lowered his muzzle onto the edge of the stretcher rail and allowed her to continue. The trouble arrived in polished shoes. Doctor. Victor Lang entered the trauma bay with his white coat unbuttoned and his expression already irritated, as if the emergency department had personally embarrassed him. He was not working the case. He rarely worked cases anymore. As hospital administrator, he appeared when donors toured the building, when reporters visited, or when something threatened the hospital's image. A wet military dog in Trauma Bay 3 clearly qualified. "Why is there an animal inside my ER?" he asked. No one answered quickly enough for him. Dr. Patel kept calling orders. The paramedics looked at the floor. The security guard straightened. Emily continued wiping blood from Marcus Hale's face. Lang's gaze landed on her because it usually did. Quiet nurses were easy targets when powerful men needed someone to blame. "Nurse Carter," Lang said, "remove the dog." Emily did not look up immediately. She secured the gauze at Marcus's temple, checked the monitor, then turned toward him. He came in with the patient. He appears to be a trained military working dog, and separating them caused distress in the field. "Give us time to stabilize the patient and contact the proper handlers." Lang's mouth tightened. "This is not a kennel. We have liability standards. And we have an unconscious veteran with no identification except the dog beside him," Emily replied. "The dog may be the only link to who he is. Animal control can sort that out." At those words, Rex rose. He did not bark. He did not bare his teeth. He simply stood, slow and deliberate, placing himself between Lang and the stretcher. The room went quiet enough for Emily to hear rain ticking against the ambulance bay doors outside. Lang took one step back before he could stop himself, and the small movement humiliated him. Emily saw it happen. So did the security guard. So did everyone else. Lang recovered by becoming colder. "Get that dog out of here now." The guard stepped forward. Rex's ears flattened. Emily moved before the guard reached the leash. She placed herself beside Rex, not in front of him like someone trying to dominate an animal, but close enough to make clear he was not alone. "Do not grab him," she said. The guard hesitated. "I was told to remove him, and I am telling you he is wounded, frightened, and attached to a critical patient. If you pull that leash in a crowded trauma bay, you could hurt him, the patient, or yourself." Lang let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Are you refusing a direct instruction?" Emily felt every eye turn toward her. This was the kind of moment most nurses learned to avoid. Hospitals ran on hierarchy as much as medicine. Doctors gave orders, administrators enforced rules, nurses absorbed the consequences. Emily had a mortgage on a small house she barely saw in daylight. She had student loans, an aging mother in Arizona, and a personnel file that had stayed clean because she did her job and avoided unnecessary fights. But Rex was trembling now, so slightly that only someone close would notice. His body was braced, ready to obey a command no one had given, ready to protect a man who could not protect himself. "No," Emily said. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It landed in the trauma bay with more force than shouting would have. Lang stared at her as if he had misheard. The guard froze with his hand halfway extended. Rex turned his head just enough to look at Emily, and for the first time since he had entered the hospital, something in his eyes changed. The hard, guarded edge softened by a fraction. He had recognized something in her, not rank, not authority, something steadier. Dr. Patel broke the silence by ordering transport to imaging, but Lang was not finished. "This conversation is not over, Nurse Carter." Emily looked back at Marcus Hale, whose blood pressure was still unstable. "No, sir," she said. "It probably isn't." They moved Marcus to CT with Rex walking beside the stretcher, and Emily holding the leash loosely enough that the dog did not feel trapped. Every few steps, Rex looked at Marcus's face. When the elevator doors opened, he hesitated, ears twitching at the unfamiliar sound, then entered only after Emily stepped in first. She did not praise him too brightly. She did not treat him like a pet. She simply stood near him, calm and steady, while the machine hummed around them. On the way back, Rex leaned briefly against her leg. It was so brief no one else noticed, but Emily did. Trust, especially from a wounded working dog, was never given casually. By midnight, they had a partial name. One of the younger nurses found a faded tattoo on Marcus's upper arm, a trident, a date, and the initials MH. A call to the VA emergency contact line produced more waiting than answers, But eventually, someone confirmed that a retired Navy chief named Marcus Hale had been treated years earlier for blast injuries and neurological complications. The file was thin where it should have been thick. Too many sections were marked restricted or unavailable. Emily had seen incomplete records before, especially with veterans whose service history crossed into classified work, but this felt different. There were gaps not only in the military history, but in recent treatment notes. Marcus had been seen somewhere. He had been discharged from somewhere, and now he had arrived half dead in the rain with his dog bleeding beside him. Rex refused water from everyone until Emily brought it. She found a stainless steel bowl in the staff break room, filled it, and set it on the floor near the unused corner of the trauma bay. He sniffed it, glanced at Marcus, then drank without taking his eyes off the bed for more than a second. When she crouched beside him with a small wound kit, he stiffened but did not move away. "I need to look at your shoulder," she said softly. "Just look. No surprises." Slowly, she lifted the wet fur near the wound. It was not deep enough to be life-threatening, but it was raw, dirty, and older than the rainstorm. Someone had neglected it. Someone had let a retired military dog walk around injured for days, maybe longer. A hospital like St. Andrew's Memorial had rules for everything, but rules often failed the people who arrived with no clean story attached to them. Emily had seen veterans brought in from shelters, from parking lots, from motel rooms, where they had been living alone with pain they never described. She had seen nurses whisper that certain patients were difficult before anyone asked what they had survived. She had seen administrators celebrate veterans on banners in the lobby, while arguing over whether their care was profitable behind closed doors. But Rex's presence made the hypocrisy harder to ignore. He sat beside Marcus like a living record of service, loyalty, and damage no policy binder could explain away. At 1:17 a.m., Lang returned with 2 security officers and a printed form in his hand. Emily was charting Marcus's vitals when she saw them at the doorway. Rex saw them first. His head lifted before their shoes crossed the threshold. Lang did not enter fully this time. He had learned enough not to step too close to the dog. "Animal control has been notified," he said. "They'll remove the animal within the hour." Emily set down the charting tablet. "That is not appropriate." Lang held up the paper. "It is already done. The patient is still unstable. The dog has remained controlled the entire time. Removing him now could agitate both of them. The dog is not the patient." Emily glanced at Rex's bandaged shoulder. "He is injured. Then animal control can evaluate him. You know what happens to an 11-year-old military dog labeled aggressive after a hospital removal?" Lang's expression did not change, but the security officer behind him looked away. That told Emily he knew. Everyone knew. A dog like Rex would not be placed gently into some peaceful retirement program if the report said he threatened hospital staff. He would be sedated, confined, assessed by strangers, and possibly destroyed if someone decided he was too dangerous or too old to save. Lang stepped closer to the doorway, careful to stay behind the security officers. "Nurse Carter, you are emotionally over-involved." Emily felt anger rise, but she kept her voice even. "No, I am clinically aware. There is a difference." For the first time, Dr. Patel came to her side. He looked tired, but his tone was firm. "Victor, the dog has not interfered with care. Give us until morning to reach a military contact." Lang looked at him with the kind of smile that punished disagreement later. "This is not a medical decision anymore." That sentence settled over Emily like cold air. Not a medical decision. There it was, spoken plainly. Marcus Hale's condition, Rex's injury, the risk of separation, the missing records, none of that mattered as much as the hospital avoiding inconvenience. Lang turned to the security officers. "Stand by until animal control arrives." Rex moved closer to Marcus's bed. His body was tired, but his purpose was not. Emily saw his legs tremble. She also saw something beneath the bed that had been pushed partly behind the wheels during the rush of treatment. A weathered military backpack, soaked, mud-stained, almost forgotten. Rex noticed her looking. His ears lifted. Then he lowered his nose toward it and gave one soft, controlled whine. Emily's attention sharpened. Until that moment, Rex had reacted only to people approaching Marcus. Now he was reacting to the bag. She glanced toward Lang, who was speaking quietly to one of the guards, then crouched as if adjusting the blanket near Marcus's feet. The backpack was heavier than it looked. One strap was torn, and dried mud covered the zipper. A small black tag hung from the side, stamped with the same name as the patch Marcus had been clutching. Rex. When Emily touched it, the dog did not growl. He leaned closer, watching her hand with desperate focus. "What is that?" Lang asked. Emily stood slowly, backpack in hand. "Patient property. I'll have security log it. I'll document it with the rest of his belongings." Lang's eyes lingered on the bag for 1 second too long. It was subtle, but Emily had spent years reading subtle things. The family member who knew more than they admitted, the doctor who had missed something and hoped no one noticed, the patient who said they were fine while their hands shook under the blanket. Lang recognized the backpack, or he recognized the possibility of what it contained. "That bag does not leave this room without authorization," he said. Emily held it against her side. "Then I'll keep it with the patient." Rex let out another low whine, and Marcus's fingers twitched on the blanket. Everyone saw it. Dr. Patel moved first, checking Marcus's pupils and calling his name. "Chief Hale?" "Marcus, can you hear me?" The monitor showed a brief change in heart rate. Not consciousness, not yet, but response. Rex placed both front paws carefully on the lower rail of the bed and lowered his head near Marcus's hand. The veteran's fingers moved again, this time brushing the fur between Rex's ears. The old dog closed his eyes. Emily felt the room shift again. In that moment, nobody could honestly call Rex just an animal in the way Lang meant it. He was connection. He was memory. He was the thread pulling an unconscious man back toward the world. Lang saw it too, and it made him more dangerous, not less. "Security stays," he said. "Animal control still comes." Emily looked at Marcus Hale, then at Rex, then at the backpack, pressed against her ribs. She understood that the first fight had not been about a dog in a trauma bay. It had been about whether anyone powerless still had the right to be protected when a system found them inconvenient. Rex had chosen his side long before entering the hospital. Marcus had no voice yet. And Emily, who had spent her career being careful, quiet, and useful, knew she was about to become a problem. By dawn, the rain had stopped, but the hospital had not calmed. Word had spread through the night shift about the old military dog in Trauma Bay 3 and the nurse who had told Dr. Lang no. Some staff avoided the room because they did not want to be involved. Others found excuses to pass by and look in. A respiratory therapist brought extra blankets. A cafeteria worker left a plain grilled chicken breast wrapped in foil, pretending she had made a mistake with an order. Rex accepted food only after Emily placed it near him and stepped back. He ate slowly, pausing between bites to check that Marcus was still there. Emily had been awake for nearly 20 hours by the time the animal control officer arrived. He was a broad man with tired eyes, carrying a catch pole he clearly hoped he would not need. Rex saw the pole and rose instantly. The room tightened. Marcus's heart rate jumped on the monitor. Emily stepped between the officer and the bed before anyone else moved. "Please put that down," she said. The officer looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I have an order to remove a dangerous dog. He has not attacked anyone. The report says he threatened staff." "The report is wrong." Lang stood behind the officer, arms folded. "Nurse Carter is not authorized to make that determination." Emily turned to him. She could feel exhaustion in her bones, but beneath it was something stronger. "Then authorize the truth. He is a retired military working dog, attached to an unidentified Navy veteran in critical condition. He is injured, he is controlled, and removing him by force will endanger this patient." Lang's voice dropped. "You are very close to disciplinary action." Emily looked down at Rex. The dog was trembling again, but he had not moved forward. He was waiting, not attacking. Waiting for a command, a signal, a reason to believe the humans in the room would not fail him. Emily reached slowly for the leash and wrapped it around her hand, not to restrain him, but to tell him she was there. Then she looked back at Lang. "Do what you have to do," she said, "but I am not letting you drag him out like a threat when he is the only one in this room who has not abandoned that man." No one spoke. The animal control officer lowered the pole a few inches. Dr. Patel stepped closer to the bed. A young nurse near the medication cart wiped at her eyes and pretended she was checking labels. Lang's face hardened in a way that told Emily the consequences would come. Maybe not in that exact minute. Maybe not while witnesses were watching. But they would come. For now, Rex stayed. And beneath Marcus Hale's bed, Inside the soaked military backpack that Lang had noticed too quickly, something waited in a sealed inner pocket. Emily did not know about it yet. She did not know that the old dog had been guarding more than a wounded veteran. She did not know that the missing records, the injured K9, the administrator's fear, and the unconscious seal were all pieces of the same buried truth. All she knew, as the morning shift began and Dr. Victor Lang walked away without another word, was that saving Rex had already put her career at risk. By the end of the next day, it would cost her everything. By 7 o'clock that morning, St. Andrew's Memorial had returned to the kind of movement that made emergencies look routine. Night shift nurses finished their charting with tired hands. Day shift staff accepted reports while sipping burned coffee from paper cups, and stretchers continued rolling through the ambulance entrance, as if the storm from the night before had washed nothing clean. But inside the quieter wing where Marcus Hale had been moved for close monitoring, the air felt different. People passed the room more slowly. Conversations dropped whenever Emily Carter approached. Everyone had heard some version of the story by then. The unconscious veteran, the old military dog, the administrator who wanted the animal removed, and the nurse who had said no in front of half the emergency department. Emily did not need anyone to tell her she had become the subject of hallway whispers. Hospitals had their own weather systems, and by sunrise she could feel the pressure changing around her. Marcus had stabilized enough to leave the trauma bay, but not enough to wake. His breathing remained shallow, and assisted by oxygen. The bruises along his ribs had darkened. The wound near his temple had stopped bleeding, though the swelling beneath the skin concerned Dr. Patel enough to order another neurological assessment before noon. Rex followed the transfer with the same painful discipline he had shown since arriving, limping beside the stretcher as if his own injury mattered only after Marcus was safe. When an orderly tried to guide the dog away from the bed, Rex did not snap or lunge. He simply planted his paws, lowered his head, and refused to move. Emily saw the exhaustion in the tremor of his legs. She saw the dirt dried into the fur behind his ears, and the way he protected his bad shoulder by leaning too much weight to the other side. He was not trying to create a problem. He was trying to finish a mission nobody else understood. Emily spent the first hour of her shift documenting everything with more care than usual. She charted Rex's presence not as an emotional detail, but as part of Marcus's response pattern. Heart rate increased when the dog was removed from visual contact, decreased when Rex was nearby, slight motor response when Marcus's fingers brushed the dog's fur. She knew the language mattered. Feelings could be dismissed. Observations were harder to erase. While she entered notes into the system, Rex lay beside the bed with his head resting between his paws, eyes half open but alert enough to follow every person who entered. When Emily approached Marcus to check his IV, Rex watched her hand, then relaxed when he recognized her. That small permission settled somewhere deep inside her. Trust from a wounded working dog did not feel like affection. It felt like responsibility. A knock came against the open door just after 8. Emily turned and saw Karen Walters from Human Resources standing in the hallway, her badge clipped neatly to a navy blazer that seemed out of place among scrubs and medical carts. Karen was not an unkind woman, but her job required her to deliver unpleasant things in a soft voice. She stepped inside, looked once at Rex, then lowered her tone. "Emily, do you have a moment?" Emily finished, securing Marcus's line before answering. "For you or for Dr. Lang?" Karen's expression tightened just enough to confirm the answer. She said Victor was concerned about liability, about chain of command, about a nurse making unilateral decisions involving an animal in a clinical area. Emily listened without interrupting, though she felt exhaustion pulling at her patience. When Karen finally said, "You know how hospitals work?" Emily looked toward Marcus's unconscious face and replied, "Yes, that's what worries me." Karen did not argue. She only warned her that Victor Lang was looking for a reason, then left the room with the careful sadness of someone who knew the machine was already moving. After Karen walked away, Emily remained still for several seconds, letting the warning settle, looking for a reason. The phrase felt almost generous, as though Lang needed one. Men like Victor Lang rarely needed reasons when they had titles, committees, and policies written broadly enough to punish anyone who became inconvenient. Emily had spent years surviving hospital politics by being useful, quiet, and excellent. She covered shifts nobody wanted, calmed patients other people labeled difficult, and absorbed pressure without turning it into drama. That was why this situation frightened her more than she wanted to admit. She knew how quickly an institution could turn a good nurse into a problem employee. All it took was one administrator with embarrassment to hide and a policy manual thick enough to make cruelty look professional. By late morning, Marcus's belongings had to be formally inventoried. There was no wallet, no phone, no keys, no watch, no clean identification card, and no family contact information that the hospital could verify. There was only the weathered military backpack that had been pushed under the stretcher during the chaos of the trauma bay. Emily brought it to the counter inside Marcus's room instead of the crowded nurses' station, partly because the hallway felt too visible, and partly because Rex became intensely focused whenever the bag moved. The canvas was old and mud-stained, the stitching worn smooth along the seams. One strap was nearly torn through, and the small black tag clipped to the side carried the same faded name Marcus had been clutching on the torn patch: Rex. Emily opened the main compartment carefully and began listing the contents in the patient property form: 2 rolled shirts, spare socks, a military canteen, a scratched flashlight, a sealed packet of protein bars, and a folded photograph wrapped in plastic. The photograph stopped her for longer than it should have. It showed Marcus several years younger, standing in desert sunlight with one hand resting on Rex's back. Around them were 4 men in tactical gear, whose faces had been partly obscured by damage to the print. No one was smiling for the camera exactly, but there was a closeness in their posture that made the image feel less like documentation and more like proof of family. Rex was younger too, ears sharp, body strong, eyes fixed just beyond the lens, as if watching something nobody else could see. Emily placed the photograph gently on the counter and continued searching the bag. That was when she noticed the inner lining did not sit right. The compartment appeared shallower than the outside dimensions allowed. When she pressed 2 fingers along the bottom seam, she felt something hard beneath the fabric, flat and narrow, hidden under a stitched layer that had been repaired by hand. Before she could examine it further, Rex lifted his head. His ears angled toward the hallway. Emily zipped the compartment closed and turned just as Victor Lang appeared in the doorway. He did not look at Marcus first. He did not ask for a medical update with the urgency of an administrator concerned about an unidentified critical patient. His eyes went to the backpack, paused there for half a second, and then moved to Emily. That half second told her more than any question could have. "How is Mr. Hale?" he asked. Emily rested one hand lightly on the bag. Stable, still unconscious, awaiting further neuro-evaluation. Lang stepped into the room but stopped when Rex rose from the floor. The dog did not growl. He simply stood between Lang and Marcus, tired but steady. Lang's face remained controlled, yet Emily saw his jaw tighten. Lang told her there would be a formal review of the previous night's events. He used the same polished tone he used in donor meetings, but the words carried an edge. He said the hospital could not allow staff to ignore direct instructions, especially when safety and liability were involved. Emily answered that safety was exactly why Rex had not been forcibly removed. Lang's gaze drifted again toward the backpack, and this time, Emily did not doubt what she had seen. He knew something about it, or feared something inside it. When he said security would be happy to log the patient's property, Emily replied that she was already documenting it according to procedure. The silence between them tightened. Rex took one slow step closer to Emily, and Lang's attention shifted to the dog with open dislike. "You are becoming emotionally over-involved," he said. Emily looked at Marcus, then back at him. "No, I'm paying attention." The rest of the day passed with the heavy patience of a storm building beyond closed windows. Marcus showed small signs of response but did not wake. His fingers moved once when Rex rested his muzzle near the bed rail, and his heart rate changed whenever Emily said his name clearly near his right ear. "Doctor." Patel took those signs seriously, which gave Emily some relief, but administration's shadow remained over everything. Twice, security officers lingered near the hallway intersection longer than necessary. Once, Emily caught a man in a hospital security uniform watching Marcus's door from the far end of the corridor. When Rex noticed him, the dog's whole posture changed. His body lowered, ears flattening, eyes fixed on the man with a recognition so specific that Emily felt a chill move across her arms. The guard looked away too quickly and disappeared around the corner. Rex remained staring after him, long after he was gone. That reaction stayed with Emily because it was not the behavior of a confused animal. Rex had ignored dozens of staff members by then. Nurses, technicians, transporters, janitors, respiratory therapists, even visitors who glanced through the window. He did not like everyone, but he tolerated anyone who moved with ordinary purpose. His response to that one security guard had been different. It carried memory. Emily wrote down the time, the hallway location, and the name printed on the guard's badge as best she could remember, S. Brenner. She had no accusation to attach to it, only an observation. Still, she saved the note privately, because something in her had begun to understand that official records could be shaped by whoever controlled them. If she wanted the truth protected, she might need more than the hospital chart. Near the end of her shift, Emily returned to the backpack. Marcus slept under monitor lights while Rex watched from the floor, his head lifted as if he knew the bag mattered. Emily did not open the hidden seam. Not yet. She was still on duty, still inside the hospital, still visible to cameras and staff who might repeat what they saw without understanding it. Instead, she completed the inventory honestly while leaving the concealed compartment undisturbed. When she picked up the old photograph again, Rex rose and came closer. He sniffed the picture once, then pressed his nose briefly against Marcus's hand. The gesture was so gentle that Emily felt her throat tighten. Whatever had happened to this man and dog, they had survived it together, and now someone inside this hospital wanted to separate them before Marcus could speak. The summons arrived the following morning through an email marked mandatory. Administration Conference Room B, 10:30 a.m. Emily read it at the nurse's station while holding a cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. She had been awake for too many hours, her hair pulled back too tightly, her eyes dry from fluorescent light and lack of sleep. Across the hall, Rex lay beside Marcus's bed with his body angled toward the door. Emily could see him through the interior window, still guarding, still waiting. She wanted to believe the meeting might be a warning, and nothing more. But Karen Walters's words returned to her. Victor is looking for a reason. Emily set the coffee down untouched and went upstairs. The meeting lasted 14 minutes, though it felt longer because every sentence had been prepared to leave no fingerprints. Victor Lang sat at the head of the table with Karen to his right and the nursing director beside her, both looking uncomfortable in different ways. Lang spoke about hospital liability, refusal to follow administrative orders, unauthorized handling of an animal, and creating a hostile environment for security personnel. Emily listened quietly. She corrected him only once, when he referred to Rex as the aggressive dog. She said, "The record should state he has not bitten, lunged at, or injured anyone since arrival." Lang smiled, as if she had proven his point by speaking. Then he slid a disciplinary acknowledgement across the table. One more incident involving insubordination or interference with hospital policy would result in termination. Emily signed the form because refusing to sign would only create a second accusation. The pen felt strangely heavy in her hand. She thought of all the nights she had stayed past shift because a patient had no one else, all the holidays she had missed, all the times administrators had praised nurses as heroes in public while treating them as replaceable in private. When she stood to leave, Lang told her he hoped she would make a more professional decision going forward. Emily looked at him for a long moment. She wanted to say many things. Instead, she said only, "So do I." Then she walked back down to Marcus's room, where Rex lifted his head the moment he saw her and thumped his tail once against the floor. The confrontation that ended her career began just before noon. Emily was changing Marcus's IV tubing when Rex stood abruptly, his eyes locked on the hallway. Seconds later, Victor Lang entered with 3 security officers behind him and an animal control officer carrying a folded restraint lead at his side. Karen was not with them this time, neither was Dr. Patel. That told Emily the decision had been timed carefully. Lang held a folder under one arm and wore the expression of a man who had already won in his own mind. "Nurse Carter," he said, "step away from the animal." Emily remained beside Marcus's bed. Rex moved closer to her, not hiding, not attacking, simply placing himself where he had always placed himself, between danger and the person he trusted. Lang stated that Rex was being removed immediately under hospital authority due to ongoing safety concerns. Emily asked to see the incident report supporting that designation. Lang replied that she was no longer in a position to debate administrative decisions. One of the security officers shifted uneasily, and Emily recognized him as the younger guard from the night Rex arrived, the one who had watched the dog protect Marcus without hurting anyone. He would not meet her eyes. The animal control officer looked no happier than he had the first time, but he took one cautious step forward. Rex's ears flattened. Marcus's heart rate climbed on the monitor. Emily saw the number change and moved instinctively closer to the bed. "Stop," she said. "You are distressing the patient." Lang's voice sharpened. "Hand over the leash." Emily looked at Rex, at the bandage on his shoulder, at Marcus's fingers curled weakly against the blanket, and at the backpack resting in the locked property cabinet across the room. She understood then that this was not about policy. Policy was only the language being used. The real objective was separation. Remove the dog, control the patient, secure the belongings, end the problem before Marcus Hale could wake up and tell anyone what had happened. Emily wrapped her hand around Rex's leash, keeping it loose so he would not feel trapped, and answered with the same word that had started everything. No. The word changed the room. The security officers went still. The animal control officer lowered his eyes. Somewhere in the hallway, a nurse stopped walking. Lang's face hardened, but beneath the anger Emily saw relief, as though she had finally given him the clean moment he needed. He opened the folder and removed a document that had clearly been prepared before he entered. His voice became formal, loud enough for the witnesses outside the door to hear. Emily Carter, due to repeated insubordination, refusal to comply with safety directives, and interference with hospital operations, your employment at St. Andrew's Memorial is terminated effective immediately. For several seconds, Emily heard nothing but the monitor beside Marcus's bed and Rex's quiet breathing at her leg. Rex leaned against her, not enough to knock her off balance, only enough to tell her he was there. The gesture nearly broke her composure. Emily had imagined losing her job in many ways over the years. Burnout, budget cuts, a mistake made after too many double shifts. She had never imagined being fired for protecting a wounded military dog from being dragged away from an unconscious veteran. Yet as Lang ordered her badge collected and told security to escort her from the clinical area, Emily felt something unexpected beneath the fear. Clarity. If the price of silence was handing Rex over and leaving Marcus defenseless, then the job had already stopped being something she could keep with honor. She removed her badge slowly and placed it on the counter. Her hands did not shake until after she let go. The younger security officer picked it up without looking at her. Rex remained pressed against her side. Lang told the animal control officer to proceed, but before anyone moved, Marcus made a sound. It was faint, barely more than air catching in his throat, but it stopped every person in the room. Rex turned instantly and placed his front paws carefully against the bed rail. Marcus's eyelids fluttered once, and his fingers moved toward the dog's head. Emily stepped forward on instinct, but Lang blocked her path with one arm. "You are no longer authorized to provide care," he said. Emily looked at him then, really looked at him, and understood why Rex had distrusted him from the beginning. It was not because Lang was loud. It was because everything about him treated living beings as obstacles when they became inconvenient. Marcus's fingers brushed Rex's ear and then went still again. The monitor steadied slightly. Everyone in the room saw it. Even Lang could not pretend the dog's presence meant nothing. But instead of softening, he turned colder. "Escort her out," he said. Emily was walked through the hallway in front of co-workers who did not know whether to look away or cry. Some stayed silent out of fear. Others looked ashamed of their silence. Rex tried to follow until the leash tightened in her hand and one of the guards reached toward him. Emily stopped immediately. "Do not pull him," she said, and something in her voice made the guard freeze. She crouched beside Rex, ignoring Lang's order to keep moving, and placed both hands gently along the sides of the dog's neck. "Stay with him," she whispered. Rex stared at her with desperate focus, as if refusing the command before she had fully given it. Emily swallowed hard. "Rex, stay with Marcus." The old Malinois trembled, torn between the nurse who had protected him and the handler he had guarded through blood, rain, and whatever terrible road had brought them there. Then, with visible effort, he stepped back toward the bed. That obedience hurt more than if he had followed her. Emily stood and walked out without looking back until she reached the elevator, because if she turned too soon, she was afraid she would not leave. Behind her, Rex gave one low, mournful whine that carried down the corridor and silenced everyone who heard it. Victor Lang had gotten what he wanted on paper. The nurse was fired, the dog was contained, the unconscious veteran remained under hospital control. But inside the locked cabinet in Marcus Hale's room, hidden beneath the false lining of a mud-stained military backpack, the thing Rex had been guarding was still there. And by firing Emily Carter in front of witnesses, Lang had made one mistake he could not yet see. He had turned the quietest nurse in the hospital into the one person with nothing left to lose. Emily Carter sat inside her car long after the hospital disappeared behind the stream of evening traffic. The engine had been turned off nearly 10 minutes earlier, yet she remained motionless, both hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, as if some part of her still expected a radio call, a patient update, or a supervisor asking her to cover another shift. For 6 years, her life had been measured by hospital clocks. Nights blended into mornings, weekends disappeared beneath overtime schedules, and entire seasons passed beneath fluorescent lighting. She had missed birthdays, holidays, and more family gatherings than she cared to count, because someone always needed care. The strange thing was that she had never truly resented it. Nursing had never been easy, but it had always felt meaningful. Now, for the first time since graduating, she was driving away from a hospital without a badge, without a schedule, and without any certainty about what came next. Yet the thing troubling her most was not the loss of her job. It was the image of an aging military dog standing beside an unconscious veteran, while powerful people seemed determined to separate them. As traffic crawled through the city, Emily replayed the previous 48 hours in her mind. The details refused to settle into a logical explanation. Marcus Hale had arrived critically injured, carrying almost no identification despite an apparent military background. His medical records contained unusual gaps. His personal belongings consisted almost entirely of a weathered backpack that seemed to attract far more attention from Victor Lang than any administrator should reasonably give to patient property. Then there was Rex. Emily had spent enough years around people to recognize fear, anger, grief, and loyalty when she saw them. The old Belgian Malinois had displayed all four. He trusted almost nobody, yet he had accepted her presence after only a few hours. He reacted strongly to specific individuals while ignoring dozens of others. Most importantly, he behaved less like an abandoned dog and more like a soldier still carrying out instructions. The longer Emily considered it, the less likely it seemed that any of this was coincidence. After arriving home, she tried to do what any reasonable person would have done. She showered, changed into comfortable clothes, drew the curtains, and attempted to sleep. The effort lasted less than an hour. Every time exhaustion began pulling her toward unconsciousness, another question surfaced. Why had Lang looked at the backpack before looking at the patient? Why had administration moved so aggressively to remove Rex? Why had a trained military dog reacted to that particular security officer in a way that suggested recognition rather than fear? By the time Emily abandoned any hope of rest, darkness had settled outside her kitchen window. She brewed coffee she did not need, opened a legal pad, and began writing down every detail she could remember. Names, times, locations, conversations, tiny observations that seemed insignificant on their own, but increasingly troubling when viewed together. Eventually, she circled a single question in the center of the page. What was hidden inside the backpack? The answer began revealing itself shortly after 8 o'clock, when her phone vibrated against the table. The number was unfamiliar, and under normal circumstances, she might have ignored it. Something made her answer, "Doctor." Patel's voice came through the line, carrying the kind of caution people used when they suspected someone might be listening. He told her he should not be calling. Emily immediately knew the conversation would not be routine. Within seconds, he confirmed her instincts. The backpack had been removed from patient property storage. According to the documentation, the transfer had been authorized by administration. Nobody could provide a satisfactory explanation for why an unconscious veteran's belongings suddenly required executive attention. As Patel spoke, Emily felt the final piece of doubt disappear. If the backpack contained nothing important, nobody would have touched it. It would have remained exactly where hospital policy required. The fact that someone had intervened so quickly after her termination transformed suspicion into certainty. Somewhere inside that bag, or somewhere connected to it, existed something powerful enough to make Victor Lang nervous. When the call ended, Emily stood alone in her kitchen staring through the darkness beyond the glass. The neighborhood around her remained quiet, ordinary, and completely disconnected from the world unfolding inside St. Andrew's Memorial. Yet she could not shake the feeling that events had already moved beyond a hospital dispute. The story no longer centered on a fired nurse defending a military dog. It centered on a wounded veteran, missing information, frightened administrators, and a mystery important enough to provoke actions that made little sense on the surface. 20 minutes later, she was back in her car, heading toward the hospital, unaware that before the night ended, she would overhear a conversation capable of changing everything she thought she understood about Marcus Hale, Rex, and the people, determined to control both. The service corridor behind the recovery wing had always been one of Emily Carter's favorite shortcuts when she still worked at St. Andrew's Memorial. Most visitors never knew it existed. It connected several departments through a narrow network of hallways, originally designed for maintenance crews, supply deliveries, and overnight staff. Years earlier, Emily had complained that the passages felt like a maze. Tonight, moving silently through the dim corridor toward Marcus Hale's room, she was grateful for every confusing turn. If Victor Lang or hospital security were watching the main entrances, they would not expect a recently terminated nurse to know half the routes hidden behind locked access doors and supply closets. The conversation she had overheard only minutes earlier continued echoing through her mind. Lang and the security officer named Brenner had not sounded like men discussing hospital procedure. They had sounded like men searching for something they desperately needed to find before someone else did. More importantly, they believed a drive had once been hidden inside the backpack. The fact that the compartment had been empty when they opened it changed the entire situation. Until now, Emily had assumed the backpack itself contained the secret. Now she realized it might only have been a decoy. Whatever Marcus Hale had been protecting, he either removed it before arriving at the hospital, or found another place to hide it after his injury. The more she considered that possibility, the more Rex's behavior began making sense. The old military dog had not spent every second watching the backpack. He had spent every second watching Marcus. Emily reached the observation window outside the room and carefully looked inside again. Marcus remained unconscious beneath the soft glow of monitor lights. His condition appeared unchanged, but Rex was no longer lying beside the bed. Instead, the Belgian Malinois stood near the rolling table positioned along the wall. The dog looked directly toward the hallway, spotted Emily through the narrow glass panel, and immediately shifted his attention downward. At first, the movement seemed meaningless. Then he repeated it. He looked at Emily. He looked toward the underside of the table. Then he looked back at her again. The sequence happened 3 times in less than 10 seconds. Emily had spent enough time around working animals to recognize intentional behavior. Rex was not wandering. He was trying to direct attention. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, he appeared to be communicating rather than merely guarding. The hallway remained quiet long enough for Emily to enter through a partially unsecured side door used by housekeeping staff. She slipped into the room and closed it behind her. The moment she stepped inside, Rex crossed the floor despite his injured shoulder and pressed against her leg. Relief washed through the dog so visibly that Emily felt her chest tighten. He had been alone for most of the day, surrounded by strangers and watched by people he clearly did not trust. She crouched beside him and gently scratched behind his ears while checking the bandage on his shoulder. The dressing had not been changed since her termination, and the edges were already beginning to loosen. "You've had a rough day, haven't you?" she whispered. Rex leaned briefly into her hand before turning toward the rolling table again. Whatever comfort he felt at seeing her return was secondary to the task still occupying his mind. Emily moved toward the table and slowly lowered herself to one knee. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Medical supply trays occupied the top shelf. Spare gauze packs and disposable gloves filled the lower compartment. Then she noticed a strip of dark fabric wedged between the rear support bar and the wall. It was small enough to escape attention during routine cleaning and positioned where nobody would normally look. Emily carefully reached beneath the table and pulled it free. The material felt familiar immediately. It matched the torn canvas Marcus had been clutching when he arrived at the emergency department. Attached to the fabric was a narrow, waterproof pouch no larger than a folded wallet. Her pulse quickened. The pouch had been deliberately hidden. More importantly, Rex had known exactly where it was. For several seconds, Emily simply stared at the object resting in her hand. The pouch showed signs of wear but remained intact. Whoever designed it had intended for it to survive rain, mud, and rough handling. Before opening it, she looked toward Marcus. The veteran remained motionless, except for the steady rise and fall of his chest. His face appeared calmer than when she had last seen him, though perhaps that was only because Rex seemed calmer. The dog sat beside her now, watching the pouch with intense concentration. It was impossible not to wonder how long he had been trying to protect it. Somewhere between Marcus's arrival and Emily's return, hospital administrators, security personnel, and perhaps others she had not yet identified, had searched for this very item, without realizing it had been hidden only a few feet from the patient's bed. The zipper opened with surprising ease. Inside rested a small encrypted flash drive wrapped in a sheet of plastic, along with a folded note written in block letters. Emily unfolded the paper first. The handwriting was uneven, as if produced under physical stress or severe exhaustion. The message contained only a single sentence. "If you're reading this, trust the dog before you trust anyone in the hospital." Emily read the line twice before lowering the paper. The simplicity of the warning made it more unsettling, not less. Marcus Hale had apparently anticipated exactly this situation. He had expected something to happen to him. He had expected people inside the hospital to become a threat. Most importantly, he had believed Rex would be capable of leading the right person to whatever evidence remained hidden. Emily slipped the note back into the pouch and examined the flash drive more carefully. It looked ordinary, yet dozens of careers, reputations, and decisions suddenly seemed connected to that small piece of hardware. Lang's behavior, Brenner's nervousness, the missing medical records, the unusual interest in patient property. None of it made sense unless someone believed the drive contained information worth protecting or destroying. Emily knew she should leave immediately and find a safer place to examine its contents. Remaining inside the hospital with the drive in her possession would be reckless. Yet before she could move, voices drifted from the hallway outside. Two men were approaching. Their footsteps carried the confidence of people who expected access rather than permission. Emily reacted instantly. She slipped the drive and note into her pocket, pushed the empty pouch beneath her jacket, and moved behind the privacy curtain separating Marcus's bed from the rest of the room. Rex followed without needing instruction. Seconds later, the door opened. Through a narrow gap in the curtain, Emily recognized Victor Lang's voice almost immediately. He sounded irritated in the controlled way people often do when struggling to hide panic. Brenner accompanied him. Their conversation confirmed what Emily had already suspected. They had searched storage rooms, reviewed camera footage, and questioned multiple employees without finding the missing drive. More troubling was Brenner's next statement. He said they were running out of time because someone from outside the hospital had started asking questions. Lang demanded specifics. Brenner hesitated before mentioning that inquiries connected to military channels had appeared earlier that afternoon. The words were vague, but they were enough to change Lang's expression. Even without seeing his face clearly, Emily could hear the tension enter his voice. The two men remained inside the room for less than 3 minutes. They never approached close enough to discover Emily hidden behind the curtain, and neither noticed that the very object they sought now rested in her pocket. When they finally left, the silence felt heavier than before. Emily waited another full minute before stepping out. Her hands were steady, but her thoughts were racing. Military channels. The phrase suggested Marcus's situation extended far beyond a local hospital dispute. Someone outside, St. Andrew's Memorial either knew he was missing or knew enough to begin searching. The question was whether help would arrive before Lang found another way to control the situation. Looking down at Rex, Emily realized the dog had unknowingly shifted the balance. As long as the drive remained hidden, Lang possessed authority. Now that the evidence existed outside his reach, authority alone might not be enough. Emily knelt beside Marcus one final time before leaving. The veteran remained unconscious, yet something about the room felt different. Perhaps it was the knowledge that his plan had not completely failed. Perhaps it was the sight of Rex sitting watch beside the bed, exactly as he had from the beginning. Emily quietly promised, that she would keep the drive safe until she understood what it contained. Then she stood, adjusted her jacket, and headed toward the service corridor with the dog watching her every step. She did not know that within the next 24 hours, someone would break into her apartment searching for the drive. She did not know that Marcus Hale was far more important than his medical records suggested. And she certainly did not know that the information now resting in her pocket would eventually bring federal investigators, military officials, and an entire network of corruption crashing directly into Victor Lang's carefully protected world. Emily did not drive directly home after leaving the hospital. Years of working in emergency medicine had taught her that instincts existed for a reason, and every instinct she possessed was warning her that the flash drive represented far more than an ordinary piece of evidence. Instead of returning immediately to her house, she spent nearly an hour moving through the city, making unnecessary turns and stopping twice in different parking lots, simply to ensure nobody was following her. The behavior felt paranoid when viewed from the outside, yet the conversation she had overheard between Victor Lang and Brenner refused to leave her thoughts. Those men had not been worried about a missing personal item. They had been worried about a missing threat. People only searched that aggressively when they believed exposure could destroy something important. By the time Emily finally returned home, the neighborhood had settled into its usual nighttime quiet. Porch lights glowed softly along the street. A television flickered through a nearby window. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent. Everything appeared normal, but normal no longer reassured her. She locked the front door, checked every window without really meaning to, and carried the flash drive into the kitchen. For several minutes, she simply stared at it resting on the table beneath the overhead light. The object itself looked completely unremarkable. It could have contained vacation photos, tax documents, or years of forgotten paperwork. Yet people inside a major hospital had already risked careers and possibly crimes trying to recover it. Whatever Marcus Hale had hidden, he clearly believed it was worth protecting even after he lost consciousness. Emily's laptop was old enough to be reliable and disconnected enough to feel safe. She rarely used it for anything beyond bills, emails, and occasional streaming services. Tonight, however, she powered it on with the same caution someone might use when opening an evidence locker. The flash drive required a password immediately. That was not surprising. What surprised her was the encryption software. Even with limited technical knowledge, she recognized that it was far more sophisticated than something an average person would install. Marcus had expected the drive to fall into the wrong hands. More importantly, he had expected those hands to know what they were looking for. Emily leaned back in her chair and considered the problem. Then she remembered the note. Trust the dog before you trust anyone in the hospital. The message felt incomplete somehow, as though Marcus assumed the right person would understand additional context. For several minutes, she reviewed every detail she could remember from the previous 2 days. Marcus's injuries, the backpack, the photograph, the torn piece of canvas he had been clutching when he arrived. Then, another memory surfaced. During the inventory process, she had noticed a faded date written on the back of the photograph. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Now, it felt intentional. Emily retrieved the photograph she had quietly copied using her phone before the backpack disappeared and zoomed in on the image. Beneath a location marker, partially obscured by damage, sat a sequence of numbers. She entered them into the password field more out of curiosity than confidence. The drive unlocked immediately. For several seconds, Emily simply stared at the screen. A growing sense of unease settled over her as folders began appearing one after another. Financial records, contract agreements, internal correspondence, audit summaries, payment transfers, hundreds of files organized with military precision. She opened one at random and quickly realized she was looking at documents connected to veteran rehabilitation funding. Another folder contained payment records involving private contractors. A third linked those contractors to medical facilities across multiple states. The deeper she looked, the more disturbing the pattern became. Millions of dollars intended for wounded veterans had been routed through shell organizations, inflated service agreements, and consulting groups that appeared to exist primarily on paper. Names repeated throughout the documents. Some belonged to executives. Some belonged to healthcare administrators. And one name appeared often enough to make Emily stop breathing for a moment: Victor Lang. The hospital administrator's name surfaced repeatedly across emails, payment approvals, and contract reviews dating back several years. At first, the connections appeared indirect. Then Emily opened a spreadsheet that removed any remaining doubt. The document tracked financial distributions from a veteran support initiative originally created to fund long-term rehabilitation programs. Large portions of that money had vanished through a network of transactions disguised as operational expenses. Several signatures appeared beside those approvals. One of them belonged to Victor Lang. Emily stared at the screen in disbelief. She had expected misconduct. She had expected corruption. What she had not expected was evidence that appeared this organized. Marcus Hale had not stumbled onto a minor scandal. He had uncovered an entire system. The realization carried another implication. If the information was genuine, Marcus's injuries might not have been accidental. Emily thought back to the wound near his ribs, the missing records, and the unusual urgency surrounding the drive. Suddenly, the sequence felt less random. Marcus had discovered something dangerous. He had attempted to protect the evidence. Then he had arrived unconscious in a hospital connected to one of the names appearing throughout the files. The coincidence stretched beyond credibility. Before she could continue reviewing documents, a notification appeared in the corner of the screen. One folder remained unopened. Unlike the others, it contained only a single video file, labeled Emergency Release. Emily hesitated before clicking it. The recording opened to reveal Marcus Hale sitting in what appeared to be a motel room. He looked healthier than he did now, though exhaustion lined his face, and his beard appeared several days old. The timestamp showed the video had been recorded less than a week earlier. Marcus looked directly into the camera for several seconds before speaking. His voice carried the steady calm of someone accustomed to operating under pressure. He introduced himself, stated his military background, and explained that if the recording was being viewed, circumstances had likely prevented him from delivering the evidence personally. He described years of investigating financial misconduct involving programs designed to assist wounded veterans. He named organizations, contractors, and healthcare administrators. Then he said something that made Emily's stomach tighten. "If you're watching this," Marcus said, "there's a good chance they're already looking for me. If that's true, they're probably looking for Rex too. He knows who can be trusted better than most people I've met. If Rex led you to this drive, pay attention to him. He's saved my life before." Emily paused the video and rubbed a hand across her face. The room suddenly felt smaller. Everything she had suspected was now supported by direct testimony. More importantly, Marcus himself believed people were actively trying to stop the information from becoming public. The question was no longer whether danger existed. The question was how close it had already come. The answer arrived a little after midnight. At first, the sound barely registered. Emily assumed it came from outside. A car door, a neighbor moving trash bins. Something ordinary. Then she heard it again. A dull metallic noise near the rear of the house. Every muscle in her body tightened instantly. The sound did not belong. She closed the laptop, removed the flash drive, and slipped it into her pocket before turning off the kitchen light. The house fell into darkness except for faint illumination spilling through the curtains. For several seconds she stood completely still, listening. The silence stretched long enough to make her wonder whether she had imagined everything. Then glass shattered. The noise erupted from the back of the house with enough force to eliminate all doubt. Someone had entered. Not attempted. Entered. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. Instinct replaced thought. She moved quietly toward the hallway rather than the front door. Years of emergency medicine had taught her that panic made people predictable. Predictable people became vulnerable. Another sound followed from the kitchen area. Slow footsteps. Careful footsteps. Whoever had broken in was trying not to be heard. That detail frightened her more than the shattered window. This was not a drunken mistake or random burglary. Someone knew exactly where they were going. Emily reached the bedroom and retrieved her phone. Her first impulse was to call the police. The second was to remember that whoever entered the house seemed interested in something specific. If they wanted the drive was the priority. She slipped it inside a small zippered pouch, tucked the pouch beneath a loose floorboard inside her closet, and forced herself to breathe. The entire process consumed less than a minute. By the time she finished, the intruder had already moved deeper into the house. A drawer opened somewhere in the living room. Another followed. Then another. The pattern became unmistakable. Someone was searching. Emily crouched beside the bedroom doorway and listened carefully. The intruder moved methodically from room to room, opening cabinets, examining shelves, and disturbing anything capable of concealing a small object. Nothing about the behavior suggested theft. Electronics remained untouched, valuable items remained untouched. The person was hunting for something specific. Her mind returned immediately to the conversation she had overheard inside the hospital. They haven't found it. The compartment was empty. The drive. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. Several minutes passed before the footsteps began moving toward the hallway. Emily tightened her grip on the phone. Then, just as suddenly as the intrusion had begun, silence returned. Another minute passed. Then two. Finally, she heard the faint sound of a vehicle starting outside. Only after the engine faded into the distance did she allow herself to move. The police arrived 20 minutes later. The responding officers were professional, thorough, and ultimately unable to provide many answers. The rear window had been forced open. Multiple rooms had been searched. Nothing appeared stolen. One officer suggested the intruder might have been interrupted before completing the burglary. Emily nodded politely, while knowing the explanation was wrong. Whoever entered the house had completed exactly what they came to do. They had searched for the drive. The fact that they left empty-handed did not make the situation safer. It made it more dangerous. Now someone knew the evidence existed outside the hospital, and they were willing to break into a private residence to recover it. Long after the officers left, Emily sat alone in the damaged living room, watching emergency lights disappear down the street. Sleep was impossible. Fear remained present, but another feeling had begun growing beside it. Determination. Victor Lang and whoever worked with him were no longer reacting like innocent people protecting their reputations. They were acting like individuals terrified of exposure. Somewhere inside St. Andrew's Memorial, Marcus Hale remained unconscious while Rex guarded his bedside without understanding how much danger surrounded them both. Emily looked toward the hidden floorboard, where the drive remained concealed, and realized that simply possessing the evidence was no longer enough. Sooner or later, she would have to decide who could be trusted with it. The difficulty was that every hour seemed to produce fewer trustworthy options than the hour before. The next morning arrived without rest. Emily had spent most of the night sitting in a chair near the front window, watching darkness slowly surrender to dawn while replaying every event that had led her there. The broken glass had been temporarily covered with plastic sheeting, and each gust of wind produced a faint rattling sound that made the house feel unsettled. Under different circumstances, she might have convinced herself the break-in was unrelated. She might have accepted the explanation offered by the responding officers and moved on, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Within hours of discovering the drive, someone had entered her home and searched room after room with clear purpose. They had not taken valuables. They had not damaged anything beyond what was necessary to gain access. They had come looking for one thing and left only after failing to find it. Shortly after 7 in the morning, her phone rang again. This time, the caller was Dr. Patel. The moment Emily heard his voice, she knew something significant had happened. Patel was not a man prone to drama, and the urgency in his tone was impossible to miss. He told her Marcus Hale had regained consciousness briefly during the early morning hours. The news hit Emily so suddenly, she nearly dropped the coffee mug in her hand. For several seconds, she forgot about the break-in entirely. Marcus was awake. After everything that had happened, after days of uncertainty and unanswered questions, the veteran had finally opened his eyes. The relief lasted only until Patel continued speaking. Marcus had been conscious for less than 3 minutes before staff were asked to leave the room. Administration became involved almost immediately. Security increased around the recovery wing. And before Patel could obtain meaningful answers, Marcus had been heavily sedated again. The explanation provided by hospital leadership sounded medically reasonable on paper. According to official documentation, the patient became confused and agitated following neurological trauma. Additional sedation had been administered for safety. Emily listened carefully before asking the question that mattered most. Did he actually become agitated? Silence lingered on the line for several seconds. Finally, Patel admitted that he had not personally witnessed any aggressive behavior. What he had witnessed was Rex reacting the moment security entered the room. According to a respiratory therapist present at the time, the old military dog had positioned himself between Marcus and two specific officers, while remaining calm toward everyone else. The description immediately reminded Emily of Brenner. More importantly, it reminded her of Marcus's recorded message, "Trust the dog." Less than an hour later, Emily found herself sitting inside a small diner several blocks from the hospital reviewing notes she had compiled over the previous days. The drive remained hidden safely at home. She had no intention of carrying it anywhere until she understood who could be trusted. Across the table sat Dr. Patel, still wearing hospital scrubs beneath a jacket thrown on in haste. He looked exhausted, conflicted, and increasingly uncomfortable with what he was witnessing inside St. Andrew's Memorial. Emily shared portions of what she had discovered, without revealing every detail. She described the financial records, the contracts, and the apparent diversion of veteran rehabilitation funds. Patel listened without interruption, but the expression on his face darkened with each passing minute. When she finally mentioned Victor Lang's name appearing repeatedly throughout the documents, Patel leaned back and stared through the diner window for several moments before speaking. "I always knew he cared more about donors than patients," Patel said quietly. "I just never imagined something like this." Emily understood exactly what he meant. Corruption often seemed abstract until it acquired faces and consequences. A budget manipulation was one thing. Millions of dollars intended for wounded veterans disappearing into private accounts was something else entirely. What disturbed Patel most, however, was not the financial aspect. It was Marcus. If the evidence proved genuine, then an injured veteran had been systematically isolated, monitored, and potentially endangered inside a hospital responsible for his care. The thought clearly troubled him more than any spreadsheet. Their conversation ended abruptly when Patel received a message from the hospital. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and immediately stood. Marcus had requested to see someone, not a physician, not administration, not security, Emily Carter. The request alone felt extraordinary given the circumstances. Marcus had barely regained consciousness, yet somehow he remembered her name. Emily's pulse quickened as Patel explained that the request came directly from the patient before additional sedation could be considered. Legally and ethically, denying such a request would be difficult. Victor Lang was reportedly furious. That alone made Emily more determined to go. Returning to St. Andrew's Memorial felt different this time. She was no longer sneaking through service corridors or avoiding security cameras. Patel arranged temporary visitor authorization through Channel's administration could not immediately override. The process generated visible irritation among several supervisors, but none could openly refuse without attracting attention. When Emily finally entered Marcus's room, the first thing she saw was Rex. The old Belgian Malinois lay beside the bed with his head resting across his front paws. The moment he recognized her scent, he pushed himself upright, despite obvious discomfort, and crossed the room. Unlike previous meetings, there was no hesitation. Rex pressed against her side with a familiarity that felt almost startling. The dog had made his decision. Whatever role Emily played in his world now, she belonged there. Marcus looked far older awake than he had while unconscious. Deep lines framed his eyes, and the injuries along his face appeared more severe in daylight. Yet despite the physical damage, there was a sharpness in his expression that had been missing before. He studied Emily carefully before speaking. His voice sounded rough from dehydration and medication, but every word carried intention. The first question he asked was not about his own condition. It was not about the hospital. It was not even about the people pursuing him. His first question was about Rex. Emily felt an unexpected lump form in her throat as she assured him the dog was alive, safe, and still refusing to abandon him. Marcus closed his eyes briefly and exhaled, as though that answer mattered more than anything else. For the next several minutes, the conversation unfolded cautiously. Marcus spoke only when necessary and often paused to gather strength. Piece by piece, he confirmed much of what Emily had already suspected. Years earlier, he became involved with oversight efforts connected to veteran rehabilitation funding. At first, the discrepancies appeared minor. Then patterns emerged. Facilities reported services that had never been delivered. Contractors received payments for programs that existed only on paper. Entire categories of care appeared inflated beyond any reasonable explanation. When Marcus pushed for answers, resistance followed. When he continued pushing, records began disappearing. Eventually, he realized the corruption extended across multiple organizations, including individuals capable of influencing investigations before they started. What surprised Emily most was the role Rex played in the story. The old Malinois was more than a retired military dog, accompanying his former handler. According to Marcus, Rex had repeatedly identified individuals involved in suspicious activity during the months leading up to the investigation. Military working dogs often notice behavioral changes humans overlook. They recognize stress, fear, aggression, and deception through subtle cues impossible to conceal completely. Several times, Marcus said, Rex reacted strongly to people who later became connected to the financial misconduct. At first, Marcus dismissed the pattern as coincidence. Eventually, he stopped ignoring it. By the time the investigation reached its most dangerous stage, Rex's reactions had become one of the few indicators Marcus trusted completely. As Marcus spoke, Rex remained beside the bed with quiet attentiveness. The dog seemed to understand far more than anyone expected. When certain names were mentioned, his ears lifted. When Brenner's name surfaced, a low rumble emerged briefly from deep within his chest, before fading again. Marcus noticed immediately. So did Emily. Neither needed to comment on it. The reaction itself said enough. For the first time, Emily began understanding why Marcus's message had emphasized trusting the dog. Rex was not simply loyal, he had become part of the investigation. The conversation ended sooner than any of them wanted. Footsteps approached from the hallway, followed by voices Emily recognized instantly. Administration. Marcus heard them too. The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. Before the door opened, he reached weakly toward the side rail of the bed and fixed his gaze on Emily. "They're going to move me," he said quietly. The statement was not speculation. It sounded like certainty. Emily asked how he knew. Marcus glanced toward the doorway where Rex had already risen to his feet. "Because they know I woke up." The door opened moments later. Victor Lang entered, accompanied by Brenner and 2 additional security officers. The atmosphere inside the room changed immediately. It was not the arrival of authority that created tension. It was the reaction of everyone present. Patel, who had remained near the doorway, visibly stiffened. Marcus fell silent. Rex moved directly between the bed and the newcomers. Even Lang seemed aware that the balance had shifted. The patient was no longer unconscious. The nurse he fired possessed information he could not fully control. And somewhere outside the room existed evidence powerful enough to threaten everything he had worked to protect. As Victor Lang began speaking about patient transfers, specialized facilities, and continuity of care, Emily realized the story was entering a new phase. Until now, the corruption had remained hidden behind paperwork, missing records, and quiet conversations. That was about to change. Marcus Hale was awake, Rex was watching, and, for the first time since arriving at St. Andrew's Memorial, the people responsible for the cover-up no longer controlled every variable. Victor Lang delivered the news with the calm confidence of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions sound reasonable. He explained that Marcus Hale would be transferred to a specialized rehabilitation facility capable of providing a higher level of neurological care. The explanation was polished, supported by carefully chosen medical terminology, and delivered with enough professionalism that an outside observer might have accepted it without question. Emily did not. Neither did Dr. Patel. More importantly, neither did Marcus. The veteran listened without interrupting, his face revealing almost nothing, but the moment Lang finished speaking, Marcus asked a simple question. Which facility? The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, yet it was long enough to expose the weakness in the explanation. Lang eventually provided a name, but Marcus recognized it immediately. So did Patel. The facility existed, but it lacked the resources necessary to justify the transfer. In fact, moving Marcus there would place him farther away from specialists, rather than closer. The contradiction hung in the air for several uncomfortable moments, before Lang shifted the conversation toward paperwork and administrative procedures. What happened next might have appeared insignificant to anyone unfamiliar with military working dogs. While the adults argued over transfer authorizations and treatment plans, Rex never took his eyes off Brenner. The security officer stood quietly near the doorway, contributing almost nothing to the discussion, yet the old Malinois watched him with a level of attention normally reserved for immediate threats. Emily had seen Rex react to Brenner before, but never this intensely. The dog's body remained controlled and disciplined, yet every instinct inside him appeared focused on that one man. Marcus noticed it as well. Without drawing attention, he glanced toward Rex and then toward Brenner before returning his attention to Lang. The exchange lasted less than a second, but Emily understood exactly what it meant. Marcus trusted the dog's judgment. If Rex considered Brenner dangerous, Marcus was treating that reaction as information rather than coincidence. The confrontation ended without resolution. Lang promised that final transfer arrangements would be reviewed over the next 24 hours before leaving the room with Brenner and the other security personnel. Once the door closed, the atmosphere changed immediately. Patel exhaled as though he had been holding his breath throughout the entire conversation. Marcus remained silent for several moments before asking whether Emily still possessed the drive. The question caught her off guard. Until now, neither of them had spoken openly about the evidence. She hesitated only briefly before nodding. Marcus looked relieved, though not surprised. "Good," he said quietly. "Because, if Lang had it, I'd probably already be gone." The statement carried no drama or exaggeration. He spoke as someone describing weather conditions rather than personal danger. That calm certainty unsettled Emily more than fear would have. For the next half hour, Marcus filled in gaps that the documents alone could not explain. Years earlier, while assisting several veteran advocacy groups, he began noticing repeated complaints involving rehabilitation programs funded through federal grants. Veterans reported receiving less care than promised. Facilities reported treatment outcomes that seemed statistically impossible. Contractors charged extraordinary amounts for services that often never materialized. At first, Marcus assumed he was looking at ordinary bureaucratic waste. Then he started following the money. What he discovered led him toward a network of administrators, consultants, and private organizations quietly redirecting resources intended for wounded veterans. Some individuals involved appeared motivated by greed. Others appeared motivated by self-preservation. Either way, the result remained the same. People already struggling with physical and psychological injuries were being used as sources of revenue. The deeper Marcus investigated, the more resistance he encountered. Records disappeared, meetings were cancelled without explanation, requests for information went unanswered. Eventually, he began receiving warnings disguised as professional advice. Friends encouraged him to stop asking questions. Former colleagues suggested the issue was larger than he realized. Then, accidents started happening. Vehicles followed him. Appointments were mysteriously cancelled. Anonymous messages appeared on his phone. None of the incidents proved anything individually, yet together they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Throughout that period, Rex became one of the few constants Marcus trusted completely. Several times, the dog reacted strongly to individuals later connected to financial irregularities. Once, according to Marcus, Rex refused to enter a building where documents were being stored. 2 months later, investigators discovered evidence had been removed from that location. Whether the dog understood the details did not matter. His instincts repeatedly pointed in the right direction. The conversation ended when Marcus's fatigue became impossible to ignore. Even brief periods of wakefulness demanded enormous effort from a body still recovering from significant trauma. Before resting, however, he made one final request. He wanted Emily to stay away from the hospital for a while. The instructions surprised her. She had expected him to ask for help gathering evidence or contacting outside authorities. Instead, he told her that remaining visible increased the danger. Lang knew her face. Brenner knew her face. If they realized she possessed the drive, the situation could escalate quickly. Emily understood the logic, but accepting it felt difficult. Walking away had never been her strength. Marcus seemed to recognize that. With a faint smile, he told her that protecting evidence sometimes mattered more than confronting people directly. Then exhaustion finally overtook him, and within minutes he drifted back to sleep. Emily left the hospital shortly afterward with more questions than answers. The drive remained hidden. Marcus remained alive. Yet the sense of approaching danger had grown stronger rather than weaker. As she crossed the parking structure toward her car, She found herself checking reflections in windows and scanning nearby vehicles without consciously deciding to do so. The previous night's break-in had altered her perspective. Threats no longer felt theoretical. Someone had already entered her home searching for evidence. The next move might be more aggressive. She was halfway across the garage when movement near a stairwell caught her attention. A man stood beside a concrete support column pretending to look at his phone. The moment he realized she had noticed him, he turned away. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was exactly what it appeared to be. Either way, Emily left immediately. 3 hours later, St. Andrew's Memorial erupted into confusion. The first indication that something was wrong came from a nurse assigned to Marcus's floor. She entered the room during a routine medication check and discovered the bed empty. At first, she assumed the patient had been transported for testing. Then she checked the schedule. No tests were ordered. No transport requests existed. Within minutes, staff began searching nearby departments. The search expanded quickly when nobody could explain where Marcus Hale had gone. Security reviewed movement logs. Administrators checked transfer paperwork. Nurses contacted supervisors. Yet every effort produced the same result. Marcus had disappeared. News of the disappearance reached Emily through Patel, whose voice sounded noticeably different this time. Concern had given way to alarm. According to preliminary reports, Marcus had not simply wandered away. Someone had moved him. Several cameras covering the recovery wing experienced brief technical failures within the same 30-minute period. Access logs showed inconsistencies. Security documentation contained unexplained gaps. Even more troubling, Brenner could not immediately account for his whereabouts during the relevant time frame. None of the information proved wrongdoing, but the pattern resembled the kind of coordinated confusion people create when they want questions to lose momentum. While administrators scrambled for explanations, one witness refused to accept any of them: Rex. According to multiple staff members, the old Belgian Malinois reacted the moment Marcus vanished. The dog searched the room repeatedly, checked adjoining hallways, and returned to the bed as though trying to confirm the absence. When staff attempted to calm him, he ignored them. When security approached, he became visibly agitated. Eventually, the behavior attracted enough attention that even people unfamiliar with the situation began noticing. Rex was not acting like a dog whose owner had been transported for routine treatment. He was acting like a dog whose handler had been taken. The most remarkable development occurred shortly afterward. While hospital personnel continued debating procedures and paperwork, Rex apparently made a decision. The dog approached the same hallway intersection where Brenner often appeared, lowered his nose to the floor, and began tracking. Several nurses initially assumed he was simply wandering. Then they realized he was following a specific path. Staff members later described the behavior as purposeful and focused. Rex moved through corridors, elevators, and service areas with surprising determination despite his injured shoulder. Eventually, he stopped outside, a section of the hospital rarely used by patients. The area contained storage rooms, maintenance access points, and several offices scheduled for renovation. More importantly, it sat far from public view. When security attempted to redirect him, Rex refused to move. That single detail spread through the hospital faster than any official announcement. By evening, rumors were circulating throughout multiple departments. Some employees believed Marcus had been secretly transferred. Others suspected administrative misconduct. A few remembered the controversy surrounding Emily's termination and began connecting events that previously seemed unrelated. Every hour Marcus remained missing made those conversations harder to control. Victor Lang understood that better than anyone. The disappearance transformed a manageable problem into a potential crisis. If Marcus resurfaced safely, questions would follow. If he failed to reappear, far worse questions would emerge. Late that night, Emily sat alone reviewing everything she had learned while rain tapped softly against the repaired plastic covering her broken window. Marcus was missing. Rex was trying to lead people somewhere. The drive contained enough evidence to threaten multiple careers, and somewhere inside St. Andrew's Memorial, panic was beginning to spread. For the first time since this nightmare started, she sensed the balance shifting away from those responsible for the cover-up. Secrets depended on control. Control depended on predictability. Marcus's disappearance had destroyed both. What Emily did not know was that Rex had already found the trail. The old military dog could not understand financial records, administrative corruption, or federal investigations. He did not need to. Someone he loved had vanished. Someone he trusted had been taken. And while executives worried about evidence and exposure, Rex was focused on a far simpler mission. Find Marcus. Stay with Marcus. Bring him home. Before the next day ended, that mission would lead directly toward a hidden section of the hospital that was never supposed to become part of the story. By sunrise, the atmosphere inside St. Andrew's Memorial no longer resembled a hospital functioning normally. Staff members continued treating patients, medications continued being delivered, and physicians continued moving from room to room. But beneath the surface, a different reality had taken hold. Rumors traveled through departments faster than official updates. Nurses exchanged worried glances near medication stations. Security personnel received conflicting instructions from different supervisors. Administrators held emergency meetings behind closed doors. Everyone knew an important patient had disappeared. What nobody could agree on was whether the disappearance represented a medical emergency, a security failure, or something far worse. The longer Marcus Hale remained missing, the harder it became for leadership to maintain the illusion that everything was under control. Emily arrived near the hospital shortly after receiving another update from Dr. Patel. She had no intention of entering through official channels. Marcus's disappearance changed the rules. If someone inside the hospital had orchestrated the removal, then administrative authority could no longer be treated as trustworthy. From her car parked several blocks away, she listened as Patel described the latest developments. Multiple employees had independently reported Rex leading staff toward a section of the building scheduled for future renovation. Maintenance workers initially dismissed the behavior. Then the dog returned again and again. Each time he followed the same route, stopped at the same corridor, and refused to leave. Eventually, even skeptical supervisors began paying attention. Working dogs sometimes became confused. They sometimes became anxious. What they rarely became was obsessively focused on a specific location without reason. The corridor in question sat behind a network of storage rooms and outdated office space near the oldest section of the hospital. Years earlier, expansion projects had transformed most of the building, but several wings remained largely untouched. Records, archives, unused administrative offices, and equipment storage areas occupied spaces that received little daily traffic. It was exactly the sort of location someone might choose if they needed privacy without attracting attention. According to Patel, Rex had spent nearly 4 hours attempting to reach one particular locked door. Security repeatedly redirected him. The dog simply returned and tried again. Eventually, a maintenance supervisor inspected the area and discovered something unusual. The electronic access logs for that section showed activity during the same period Marcus disappeared, yet no authorized work orders existed to explain it. Emily arrived just as hospital leadership began realizing they had a serious problem. News of the missing patient had already spread beyond the building. Family members overheard conversations. Employees texted former co-workers. Someone contacted a local journalist. More concerning for Victor Lang, inquiries had started arriving from outside organizations connected to veteran advocacy groups. Marcus Hale was not supposed to generate that level of attention. The original plan, whatever it had been, likely depended on isolation and confusion. Instead, every passing hour produced more witnesses, more questions, and more opportunities for mistakes. Desperation was beginning to replace confidence. The turning point came shortly before noon. A maintenance manager finally received authorization to inspect the secured area Rex had been targeting. Several administrators objected, arguing that unrelated construction materials created safety concerns. Others insisted the search proceed. By then, too many employees had become aware of the situation to quietly dismiss it. A small group consisting of maintenance personnel, security representatives, and medical staff approached the locked section, while Rex strained against his leash with renewed urgency. According to everyone present, the old Malinois seemed to know exactly where he was going. The moment the outer door opened, he moved forward despite the pain in his injured shoulder and headed directly toward the far end of the corridor. What they found there changed everything. Behind a storage area rarely used by hospital personnel sat a small recovery room originally designed decades earlier for temporary patient overflow. The room was not listed among active treatment spaces. It was not supposed to contain anyone. Yet when the door opened, Marcus Hale was inside. He lay connected to monitoring equipment, heavily sedated, and clearly disoriented, but alive. The discovery triggered immediate chaos. Nurses rushed forward. Physicians demanded explanations. Supervisors began calling administrators. Rex reached the bedside before anyone else and positioned himself beside Marcus exactly as he had done since the beginning. Witnesses later described the scene as both heartbreaking and impossible to ignore. The dog had spent hours trying to lead people to his handler while authority figures repeatedly attempted to redirect him elsewhere. Victor Lang arrived minutes later and immediately began offering explanations. Documentation errors, miscommunication during transfer preparation, temporary relocation due to room availability. The problem was that none of the explanations matched available evidence. Access records contradicted administrative timelines. Staff members denied authorizing the move. Most importantly, no legitimate medical reason existed for placing a recovering neurological patient in an inactive section of the building without proper oversight. Even employees normally reluctant to challenge leadership struggled to accept what they were seeing. The questions multiplied faster than answers could be invented. While the hospital attempted to contain the damage, events outside the building continued accelerating. Emily had spent much of the morning reviewing additional files from the drive and quietly sharing portions of the evidence with an attorney recommended through a veteran advocacy organization. The attorney initially approached the material with caution. Within an hour, he changed his tone completely. The documents did not resemble speculation or incomplete allegations. They resembled evidence. Financial records aligned. Email chains matched transaction dates. Internal communications referenced decisions that later appeared in accounting documents. By early afternoon, multiple copies of the files existed outside Emily's control. For the first time since Marcus arrived at the hospital, destroying the evidence was no longer a realistic option. The response came faster than anyone expected. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a convoy of black vehicles entered hospital property. Staff members initially assumed a donor event or executive visit was underway. Then they noticed the individuals stepping out. Several wore federal credentials. Others carried themselves with the unmistakable posture of active duty military personnel. The arrival generated immediate attention throughout the facility. Employees gathered near windows. Supervisors hurried through hallways. Security officers received instructions that seemed to change every few minutes. By the time Victor Lang learned who had arrived, the visitors were already inside the building. The title of the story would later be repeated in countless conversations. Navy SEALs stormed the hospital. In reality, the scene was both quieter and more devastating. Nobody crashed through doors. Nobody rappelled from rooftops. There were no dramatic tactical assaults. Instead, a small group of military representatives accompanied federal investigators with a level of authority that made resistance impossible. They moved directly toward administrative offices carrying warrants, documentation requests, and questions that demanded immediate answers. The effect was far more powerful than any display of force. People who had spent years controlling information suddenly found themselves answering to individuals beyond their influence. Emily watched part of the arrival from a distance and felt something she had not experienced in days. Relief. Not complete relief. The danger was far from over. But for the first time, powerful people were asking the same questions she had been asking from the beginning. Who moved Marcus Hale? Why were records missing? Why did financial documents connect veteran care funds to suspicious transactions? And why had a hospital administrator shown such extraordinary interest in a retired military dog and an unconscious veteran? Those questions were no longer hers alone. Inside the hospital, the investigation expanded rapidly. Staff interviews began almost immediately. Security logs were collected. Electronic access records were preserved before alterations could occur. Several employees who had remained silent out of fear finally started talking. Once people realized outside investigators were involved, memories became easier to share. Small inconsistencies that seemed unimportant individually began forming a larger picture. Missing paperwork, unusual directives, restricted access, administrative pressure. The story grew with each statement. By evening, The issue had expanded beyond one patient, one hospital, or even one organization. Perhaps the most significant moment occurred in Marcus's room shortly before sunset. Though still weak, he had regained enough awareness to understand that circumstances were changing. Rex remained beside him, refusing food, rest, or comfort whenever it required leaving the bedside. Several military representatives visited privately, speaking with Marcus for nearly an hour. Nobody outside the room heard the full conversation. They did not need to. When the meeting ended, one of the visitors approached Emily directly. He thanked her for protecting the evidence. Then he looked toward Rex and added something she would never forget. That dog kept this case alive. The statement carried more weight than any official recognition. Throughout the entire ordeal, Rex had done exactly what he was trained to do. He protected his handler, he identified danger, he guarded evidence. And when everyone else became distracted by paperwork, authority, and excuses, he simply followed the truth. As darkness settled outside St. Andrew's Memorial, Victor Lang sat alone inside an office, no longer protected by confidence or influence. Investigators had questions. Financial records had answers. Witnesses were beginning to cooperate. Somewhere in the building, Brenner was also being questioned. The network Marcus Hale spent years uncovering was finally starting to unravel. Yet for Emily, the most important victory remained simpler than any legal outcome. Marcus was alive, Rex was alive, and the people who had tried to separate them had failed. The story, however, was not finished. Investigations moved slowly. Accountability often arrives later than people hope. Before true justice could take shape, hidden evidence still needed to be verified, witnesses still needed protection, and one final truth remained buried inside the records Marcus had risked everything to preserve. The next phase would determine not only who was responsible, but how many lives had been affected by decisions made behind closed doors for years. The weeks that followed felt strangely quiet compared to the chaos that had come before. Investigations rarely unfold with the dramatic speed people imagine. There were no immediate press conferences announcing victory, no overnight confessions, no single moment when every secret suddenly became public. Instead, accountability arrived through interviews, audits, subpoenas, and thousands of pages of documents that investigators spent long days organizing into something courts and oversight agencies could understand. Yet, beneath that slow process, the direction of the story had already changed. For years, people like Victor Lang had operated under the assumption that nobody would connect the pieces. They believed records could disappear, questions could be delayed, and vulnerable people could be ignored without consequence. Once the evidence left their control, that confidence began collapsing. Marcus Hale remained hospitalized for several more weeks, under the supervision of physicians who actually focused on his recovery rather than his inconvenience. The neurological injuries proved serious, but not permanent. Each day brought small improvements. His speech grew stronger, his memory sharpened, the periods of exhaustion became shorter. Recovery moved slowly, yet for someone who had nearly disappeared inside a forgotten section of the hospital, every step forward felt significant. Through it all, Rex remained exactly where everyone expected him to be. Nurses joked that the old Malinois knew the treatment schedule better than half the staff. Therapists learned to leave enough space beside Marcus's chair for the dog to rest comfortably during rehabilitation sessions. Even physicians who initially viewed him as a complication eventually stopped questioning his presence. After witnessing what had happened, few people could honestly argue that Rex was merely a pet. The investigation revealed far more than anyone anticipated. What initially appeared to be a local corruption case expanded into something much larger. Multiple facilities across several states became subjects of review. Financial records uncovered patterns stretching back years. Contractors who once seemed untouchable suddenly found themselves answering uncomfortable questions. Some attempted to blame subordinates. Others claimed ignorance. A few simply disappeared behind attorneys and carefully prepared statements. Yet documents have a way of preserving truths people later wish to deny. Every payment approval, every email chain, every authorization left traces. Marcus had spent years gathering those traces. Emily had protected them when it mattered most. Together, those efforts created a record powerful enough to survive denial. Victor Lang's downfall occurred gradually, and then all at once. At first, he remained confident. He hired legal counsel, issued statements through representatives, and insisted every decision he made had been guided by patient welfare. For a brief period, some people even believed him. Then additional evidence surfaced. Internal communications contradicted public claims. Access logs raised new questions about Marcus's disappearance. Employees who had remained silent for years finally began speaking openly. The version of events Lang presented became harder to maintain with every passing week. By the time formal actions were initiated against him, the outcome surprised almost nobody. The administrator who once controlled every room he entered now found himself sitting across tables from investigators, asking questions he could not easily avoid. Brenner's situation unfolded differently. Unlike Lang, he lacked the power to shape public narratives. The evidence surrounding his actions proved difficult to explain, particularly once electronic records and witness statements were compared. What emerged was a portrait of someone who spent years convincing himself he was following orders rather than making choices. The distinction mattered less than he hoped. At some point, every person becomes responsible for the decisions they continue making. Brenner eventually learned that lesson the hard way. For Emily, however, the most important outcome was not punishment. It was truth. The people responsible no longer controlled the story. Several months after the investigation began, St. Andrew's Memorial contacted Emily with an offer. The hospital board had changed significantly. New leadership wanted to repair relationships, rebuild trust, and demonstrate accountability. Reinstatement was available immediately. Her employment record would be corrected. Compensation for wrongful termination would be discussed. The proposal arrived in a professionally written letter that many people would have considered a victory. Emily read it twice before setting it aside. She felt no anger toward the nurses, physicians, or support staff who remained there. Most had been trapped inside the same system she confronted, yet returning no longer felt right. Too much had changed. The hospital represented a chapter of her life, not the future she wanted to build. The decision surprised some people, especially Marcus. One afternoon, while sitting outside the rehabilitation center where he continued receiving treatment, he asked whether she had considered accepting the offer. Emily smiled and admitted she had thought about it. Then she looked toward Rex, who was stretched comfortably across a patch of grass nearby, enjoying a rare moment when nobody expected anything from him. "I spent years helping people inside buildings someone else controlled," she said. "Maybe it's time to help people somewhere different." Marcus understood immediately. Some experiences change what success means. Surviving the past sometimes creates room for a better future. The idea began as a conversation and gradually became a plan. Veteran advocacy groups connected Emily with organizations interested in improving long-term support services. Former military personnel volunteered time, expertise, and resources. Medical professionals frustrated by bureaucracy offered assistance. What emerged over the following months was not a massive institution or ambitious corporation. It was something much simpler. A community-based recovery center focused on veterans, service families, and retired military working dogs. The mission reflected lessons learned from everything Marcus, Emily, and Rex had endured. People recovering from trauma often needed dignity as much as treatment. Service dogs deserved care after years of sacrifice. And healing happened best when individuals felt seen rather than processed. The center opened nearly a year after Marcus first arrived at St. Andrew's Memorial. It occupied a modest property outside the city, surrounded by trees and open space. There were no grand ceremonies or expensive publicity campaigns. Most of the first visitors arrived through word of mouth. Veterans recommended it to other veterans. Families shared information with friends. Slowly, the community grew. Some people came seeking medical support. Others simply wanted a place where nobody needed explanations for experiences difficult to describe. What surprised Emily most was how often visitors asked about Rex. By then, the old Malinois had become something of a legend among people familiar with the story. Many arrived expecting an intimidating military dog. Instead, they found an aging companion who spent most afternoons sleeping in sunny patches of grass and accepting gentle attention from anyone Marcus trusted. Age eventually began catching up with Rex in ways even loyalty could not overcome. The injuries he carried for years became harder to ignore. Long walks turned into short ones. Running became a memory rather than a habit. Yet something remarkable happened during that period. For perhaps the first time since leaving military service, Rex appeared peaceful. He no longer needed to guard evidence. He no longer needed to watch doorways or identify threats. His days filled with ordinary moments. Children threw tennis balls he occasionally chased. Veterans sat beside him during difficult conversations. Marcus often found him sleeping beneath a tree near the edge of the property, content simply to rest where he could see the people he cared about. One evening, nearly 18 months after the events at the hospital, Emily remained outside after most visitors had gone home. The sun hung low above the horizon, bathing the property in warm orange light. Marcus walked slowly across the field, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Rex rested nearby with his head raised, watching birds move through the distant trees. Nothing about the scene felt dramatic. No reporters waited nearby, no investigators asked questions, no administrators issued threats. The chaos that once dominated their lives had finally faded into memory. Marcus lowered himself into the chair beside Emily and handed her a cup. For several minutes, neither spoke. They simply watched the sunset. Eventually, Emily looked toward Rex and smiled. The old Malinois had fallen asleep again, his breathing slow and steady. "You know," she said quietly, "he's the reason any of this happened." Marcus followed her gaze and nodded. Most people would have pointed toward the evidence, the investigation, or the corruption case. Marcus knew better. None of those things would have mattered if Rex had failed at the simplest mission he ever received: protect the handler, stay loyal, never quit. The dog had done exactly that from the beginning. As darkness slowly settled across the property, Marcus thought back to the hospital room where everything nearly ended. He remembered the confusion, the fear, and the uncertainty. More than anything, he remembered opening his eyes and finding Rex still there. Some forms of loyalty are so complete, they become impossible to measure. They exist beyond contracts, promises, or obligations. They survive fear, pain, and time itself. Rex never understood financial corruption. He never cared about investigations. He simply refused to abandon someone who needed him. In the end, that refusal changed countless lives. And for the people who knew the full story, that was the part worth remembering.